Welcome to Hub Dialogues. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David Frum for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll look back at some of the big issues and questions from the past year and look ahead to the ones that may animate 2024. David, thanks as always for joining us.
And thank you for the year of conversation. You forced me to think through some challenging things, and I have so been delighted by the interaction with the Hub audience. And so thank you. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation in the year ahead.
That's kind of you to say, David. We covered a lot of big issues this year, and perhaps none bigger than Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel in October, the subsequent military campaign, and arguably, in a lot of ways, as importantly, the reaction around the world. What has surprised and disappointed you over the past few months, and how defining do you think these developments will be for the Middle East and our own societies?
Let me put it this way. The disappointing things have not been surprises, and the surprises have not been disappointing. I think people who are a little younger than me, and you're one of them, have a vision that there was some period of bipartisan consensus in support of Israel and against terrorist attacks on Israel. And what we're seeing now on social media that is so visible is some kind of change. It's a change in behavior and it's a change in visibility. But there was never a time when Israel could count on the support of the Western world. Let me put it this way: if there had been such a time, there wouldn't have been an Israel. Israel is a response to the problem of that Jews cannot count on, unfortunately, their neighbors consistently not to attack them and not to support the people who do attack them. There was no what we are hearing and seeing. It's different because of social media, but it's not different in kind from the kinds of reactions we had in 1982. When Israel went into Lebanon in pursuit of the PLO. It's not different, by the way, from 1973 or even 1967, or even before that. I saw on YouTube a clip from before the Six-Day War, back in the 1950s, that Mike Wallace, who was then a very important American television interviewer, interviewed Arnold Toynbee, who was then a much admired
Yes, of course.
historian. He's a crackpot, but he was at the time a huge deal. And Toynbee was explaining how in the 1950s, that Israel's fascist behavior had alienated the goodwill it had won from the Holocaust. So it's always been the same. What has changed is social media clout chasing. And one of the things that is a kind of bitter irony for people on the other side of this debate from me is if you want to be an effective advocate for the Palestinian cause, do not do the things that get you social media clout. Do not do vandalism. Do not stage confrontations. Do not wrap a bandana under your face so you look like a highwayman or a thug or a terrorist yourself, and then try to frighten children visiting Santa. Those are counterproductive actions, but they're all driven by the quest for social media clout. So that is the surprise to me has been, in fact, we're now heading toward the third month since October 7th. And the solidarity not only of the United States government, but of the European Union governments and the government of the United Kingdom has been undiminished. And that is to me a surprise. I did not think that Israel would have as much time as it has been allowed, and I'm very grateful for that. The government of Canada has unfortunately played a more ambivalent role. Not yet a negative role, but a decreasingly positive role. And Canada has made some symbolic steps that were very unfortunate. I hope this thank you video Christmas greeting from Hamas to the government of Canada is a warning to people. If Bin Laden is sending you thank you so much for your kind words notes, you need to rethink what you're saying, because you shouldn't be getting those notes.
Yeah, that's a Christmas card nobody wants to receive, or most people ought not to receive in their mailbox. Your answer, David, possibly trumps my next question, but I have to put it to you because I do think it reflects the feelings and sentiments of a lot of people in the Hub community, and that is the notion that our democratic pluralism has been put to a test this year, and many are feeling like it hasn't proven as strong as we thought. You mentioned protests, intimidation, violence.
Yeah.
even harassment in shopping centers in recent days. What, if anything, should come out of this experience? Does it require greater scrutiny at what's happening at Canada's still mostly publicly funded universities? Do we need to ask ourselves tougher questions about immigration integration and settlement? And in light of the foreign interference stories from earlier in the year, do we even need to rethink how we do politics itself?
Yeah. Well, I would say, look, I have been an advocate that Canada needs to rethink immigration because Canada's immigration policies and Canada's housing policies are so misaligned that you have to choose one. I mean, we are either going to continue the immigration as we're having it, in which case you need to pave the green belt. You just need to say you need to get rid of zoning. We are building we're going to make every Canadian city look like Hong Kong because otherwise there won't be homes for people, and not just immigrants, but they're in the same competing in the same housing market as the native born and the children of the native born. So if you're going to have this many immigrants, build everywhere. And that means zoning goes, that means environmental rules go. Or you bring your immigration policies in line with your housing policies. If you're not going to build so much, then you can't take so many people. It's not complicated. So that's the reason to rethink the immigration policies. For me, I think the most important lesson is that in certain progressive quarters, the concept of what is speech has gotten very muddied, and that they are both the classic speech classic with the little, with the formula with the cane sugar. So speech classic has been disfavored because we're told that speech classic is violence. Speech classic can hurt people. Meanwhile, new speech, meaning intimidation, meaning vandalism, that there are that there's a demand to give speech-like protection. And there was a huge uproar. People say, I want to be able to throw red paint on the door of a store, and I want to plaster it with hostile placards, and commit acts of vandalism or assemble a mob in front of a business and frighten people as they try to come in. And we regard that as expressive activity and therefore speech protected. But meanwhile, if you say it didn't, that the native mass grave story didn't happen the way it was reported, that should be criminalized, because that's speech classic, no, new speech, yes. So we need to get, I think, a clear idea. We need to reinforce that there is a line where speech is speech, even if you don't like it, it's protected. If anybody wants to publish an op-ed in the Globe and Mail saying Israel is committing genocide, if they want to form in a public place and have signs saying Israel is committing genocide, that's speech, that's legal. If you want to harass, intimidate, commit acts of symbolic violence tending toward actual violence, if you want to threaten people's lives in front of a police officer, that is not speech, and that is not protected. And I don't know if Canada has on the books that the laws that many southern states do, the anti-masking laws originally adopted in the wake of the Ku Klux Klan. It said you cannot go to a protest wearing a mask. If you don't have those rules, those should be on the books. And if you do have them, they should be enforced. Because why do people mask at a protest? Because they're going to break the law. And they know they're about to break the law. So the best way to enforce the law is to say, sorry, that you get ticketed. It's not a crime to wear a mask, but you pay $500. And then when you take the mask off, then we can see who you are if you throw a brick through a window, because that is not speech. So that is my top recommendation. And this should apply everywhere. It should apply on university campuses too. And university campuses, just because they're more full of idle people, there's greater propensity for mischief there, and idle people who have often undeserved ideas of their own intellectual superiority to their neighbors. There's a lot of malicious activity that takes place there, but the rules need to be the same, which is speech, menacing is not speech. Speech is protected, menacing is not. If we can get that idea reaffirmed out of this sad period, that would be a gain.
You've been a major champion of Western support for Ukraine, including in a must-read article for The Atlantic in the past couple of weeks. Canada has been mostly immune to the conservative apprehension or even opposition to financial and military support. Yet I note that not only has the Conservative Party of Canada's support been questioned a bit in recent weeks, but this week, the Toronto Sun, a major conservative daily newspaper here, had a cartoon that depicted President Zelensky pickpocketing Joe Biden. As someone who spent a lot of time in conservative foreign policy circles, What do you think explains the degree of
Yeah.
conservative aversion to supporting Ukraine?
Yeah, I have to say this. I am more surprised and more horrified by this. This has the decline of support for Ukraine on the political right has, because you would think this would mobilize everything that pulled a person into the political right in the first place. The belief that aggression has to be met with defense, not with words. That there's a community of democratic nations that are qualitatively different from non-democratic nations. That the West, that there is the Western democracy, and I don't like the geographic term for the West because, of course, Japan is a bulwark of the West, and depending on, at least from our point of view, if you start on our hemisphere, they look like they're in the other hemisphere, but they're, Taiwan and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand. They are not geographic West, and yet, so that's not the right term. We're going to need another one, the democratic world. But we are all in this together. Those are the ideas that pulled me into conservative politics in the first place back in the late 1970s. I think among the things that is happening, and this is, I think, affecting the debate in Canada, there is this sub-media, I call it the undernews, that you see in various kinds of places that are not readily visible. They're on people whose shows have been canceled from YouTube, who are on Rumble or some others, or on a Discord server. All of these chat boards and so on. And there is gathering there a series of highly crazy, paranoid ideas about Ukraine that are rooted in Russian propaganda, in anti-Semitism, in conspiracy theory, in alienation from the mainstream currents of society. And this is tugging a lot of people in the conservative world. You see this very much in the United States, where you can chart there were important votes in the House of Representatives on aid to Ukraine in March of 2022, May of 2022, September of 2022, and then a series in 23, culminating in the stall on Ukraine aid now. And you can just see we're now at a point where a slight majority of the Republican House caucus is on the anti-Ukraine side. Now, it's still 3/4 of the House of Representatives is pro-Ukraine and almost all of the Senate, but the anti-Ukraine sentiment is growing, and it's driven by loyalty to far-right causes. It's driven by loyalty to Trump. It's driven ultimately by fascination with Russia and Putin, and it's really alarming. And Canada is not immune. There have been votes in the Canadian House of Commons, symbolic only. But the thing about a symbolic vote, if it's a symbolic vote and it's meaningless, why don't you vote for the right way? Like sometimes there are tough votes, but and even sometimes in a symbolic vote, there's a sentence you don't love. But yeah, no, there's the Canadian Conservative Party is making concessions to people who are influenced by this flow of undernews, and it's very alarming. It's very alarming. And next year is going to be tough. It's going to be a huge fight. Ukraine is running low on supplies. There was supposed to be a big aid package in December. It's stalled until January. We have to hope to God it prevails in January, but Ukraine could be betrayed by the people it look to be trusted. And I think anyone who's part of that betrayal will live forever in shame.
Yeah, hear, hear. Let's turn to the Conservative Party of Canada more directly, which ends the year in a strong position. It leads national polling by a considerable majority. And if an election were held today, it would be poised to win one of the largest parliamentary majorities since the 1980s. What have the Conservatives done right in your mind, and what should they be focused on as we enter 2024?
Look, when we began talking about this topic in 2022, one of the themes I kept stressing is oppositions do not win elections, government lose them, at least in Westminster countries. And the actions of the opposition are important mostly in preserving the freedom of the future government to act, and in getting ready, and in building, making sure you have a good team and recruiting the right kinds of MPs. So I would say very little of what has happened to the Conservative Party represents anything that the Conservatives have done. And almost all of it is driven by what was the most important Canadian fact of the year, which is that Canada has emerged from the pandemic with an ever-widening gap between the performance of the Canadian economy and the performance of the American economy. And Canadians can see it. Americans don't see it. But because they're looking at the gap between here's perfection and here's the United States, and so the United States is not quite even with perfection. But Canada says, I don't know, the American line looks up to us. And so they're very dissatisfied with the government of the day, partly for things partly that are the government's fault, and for other things that reflect deeper structures in Canadian life. The failure to have significant improvements in the free trade regimen over the past quarter century. Free trade is not something you do. You do once and then forget. That it has to constantly, you have to constantly be working, because there's so many pressures to close markets. You have to constantly work to keep markets open. And if you're the smaller of the two trading partners, it's especially urgent to you to keep. I think the way to think about this metaphor is it's like somebody who's got a susceptibility to some kind of arterial disease. You need to constantly be working to keep those arteries flowing, or else they will tend to clog. And then if they clog, the results are calamitous. So that's, but some of the decisions are the government's. Canada has chosen to increase spending dramatically, but not in ways that enhance productivity. Unlike some of the investments that the Biden administration has been making, which are pro-productivity, Canadian investments, Canadian spending has all been consumption. Yes. And so Canada is not building the healthier economy of the future. And then there's the chronic problem of the housing shortage, which just means that Canadians are commuting longer. If you're commuting, you're probably not doing anything productive. And Canadians are overspending on their houses, and therefore spending less on other things that they also need, many of them productive investments. And above all, they're spending less on having children, which is a real sacrifice of the future for the present. So some of those are the government's fault. But that's the story. That I think the government is hoping that the interest rate cuts that are probably coming in 2024 in the United States and that can then follow in Canada, that those will improve its positions. I think that's probably a fair bet. And I think the government is also hoping, because there is a record here, that the present leadership of the Conservative Party does not believe my theory that governments lose. They believe that oppositions can win. And so they keep doing things. And many of the things they do are ill-advised. And so the strategy for the government is hold on to as long as you can, hope for interest rates cuts, hope that the American economy really revs up in 2024 and takes the Canadian economy with it, and then wait for the opposition party to make mistakes, as it has a proven record of doing.
A conversation about Canadian conservatism is perhaps a good or bad segue into what's happening in Republican politics. This week, a Colorado court ruled that Donald Trump is disqualified from being on the ballot in the state due to his role in the January 6th riots on Capitol Hill. I would just say in parentheses, for listeners and viewers interested in the subject, they ought to read David's must-read article on the subject. But it raises broader questions about Trump's extraordinary staying power with Republican voters. In hindsight, David, is there in your mind a parallel universe where someone could have dislodged him as a Republican frontrunner this year? And what would have that taken compared to what Ron DeSantis and others have done in the current presidential cycle?
I don't think there is such a parallel universe. The parallel universe is if the Electoral College had taken a slightly different turn in 2016 and Donald Trump had lost that presidential election, Republicans would have looked at it and said, nominating Trump was obviously stupid. In 2016, he got less of the vote than Mitt Romney had gotten in 2012. That you would have said, well, look at where Romney was at 47+% of the popular vote. Look where Trump was, barely above 46. We gave away a whole point of the vote because this guy was such a jerk and an obnoxious creep. And we need to get back on the Romney line. At least Romney got 47%. And build on Romney and reject Trump. And then Republicans would have had a great 2018 instead of the wipeout they had. Remember, they had majorities in both House and Senate in 2016. They would have expanded those majorities in 2018. And then some reasonable, normal person, probably Nikki Haley, because there would have been no Ron DeSantis without Trump. Because Ron DeSantis won in 2018 as governor of Florida because of he was not such an attractive candidate. He won a squeaker of a race because he had a lot of support from Trump, who was then very popular with Florida Republicans. So with no Trump, no DeSantis, Nikki Haley, a woman with partly an immigrant background, she would be very appealing. And the Republicans would have had a crusher of a year in 2020, and an echo of their massive win in 1920, and we'd be in a conservative period in the 2020s that would be much more stable and productive, and the whole world would have been different. I think what has happened is Trump has energized something that was there in the United States and is there in all the developed countries, which is the trend away from conservatism to reactionary authoritarianism. And you see it in almost every European country, where Christian democratic parties or what conservative parties are fading, and populist parties, for lack of a better term, neo-fascist parties often have come to the fore. And sometimes countries get lucky, as Italy has done, where the person in charge of this new party of the right turned out to be a reasonably responsible actor, and then then you can actually continue your strong democratic traditions. Sometimes they get unlucky, as Germany, where the people in the party are really nasty pieces of work, and the old Christian democratic structures get devoured. And that's the story of the United States. Canada is not immune to any of these trends. I remember just after Trump was elected, I did a session with graduate students at the University of British Columbia, and actually this may have been just as Trump was in. So I reviewed the case histories of Britain, Germany, France, the United States, and said, as of the middle 2010s, Canada was immune. Had this had not happened, why not? These are political science. And the answer they all gave was some variation of, because we're so awesome. I thought, it's not my position here to tell a room full of PhD candidates that you're wrong, but I don't think you're right, because I think Canadians belong to the same human race as everybody else and have the same temptations and tendencies. But Canada was a laggard. I don't think that's continuing. And I think we saw in the reactions to the pandemic, and we're seeing now in some of the changes in Ukraine, that these ideas are gaining ground in Canada, and Canadians need to be wary of them. And Canadian political leadership needs not to indulge these attitudes, but to really fight them. And one other lesson from Donald Trump, and this is the lesson that for all conservative parties everywhere else, it is always preferable to lose an election than to lose control of your identity. And if you have a significant authoritarian force that has grown up within your party, do not help them in the name of party unity. Say, you know what, we're going to take the L this time, and we're going to pin the L on these people, and then we will rebuild from there. Better to take the L once. That's the point of a democratic. In a democratic system, it's never so terrible to lose an election. It shouldn't ever be so terrible. We're going to unless there's a faction in your party that says we're going to make this election the last election. And if you have such people, then it is very serious to lose. So if you have such people and they're growing, they're a parasite within your own political organization, taking it over, take the loss, do not cooperate, rebuild.
And final question, David. For the past 12 months, you've not only helped us think through a lot of the big issues and questions, but you've also helped us to anticipate them. What are some of the sleeper issues that you're looking towards 2024 and you think our listeners and viewers ought to pay attention to?
Yeah. One is here's the thing that didn't happen. We've had tremendous success managing the global energy problem through the Ukraine war, and now through a war. We have a war both in the world's largest food producing region and the world's largest fuel producing region, or what used to be. Now the United States is the world's largest fuel producing region. And the shocks have been very successfully managed. So let's pat ourselves on the back collectively. And people in Europe especially have made real sacrifices on the energy front. And we're now halfway through winter. And again, despite terrorism by Iran-backed groups in Yemen in the shipping lanes of the Red Sea, the liquid natural gas situation is a little more tense than it was 2 weeks ago, but it's not unbearable. A sleeper issue for 2024 first is something I would have said in 23 is to say, you know what, this was successfully managed. And one of the great injustices of politics is no one gets credit for the bad things that could have happened but didn't. So here's a bad thing that could have happened that didn't. We are probably going to have a hot summer in 2024 again. We need to be thinking about the climate problem, not in hysterical, apocalyptic Greta Thunberg terms, but in real world policy terms. We need to accelerate the transition to non-fossil fuel sources of energy, and it's doable. It's really doable. And the costs we will pay in advance are fractions of the costs we will pay if we have to mitigate later. So do it now. And don't look at it as like things like carbon tax. Don't look at them as revenue measures. Look at them as change forcing measures, but using markets to change the forces. Government does not know the right way to make this transition. The market collectively can figure it out. So incentivize the market to say, where does it make sense? And non-fossil fuel alternatives it's bigger than just transitioning from coal to wind power. A lot of it is about reorganizing how cities work, so people walk instead of using transit of any kind. A lot of it is rethinking how work works, so people can work remotely. They don't need they save the journey. A lot of it is rethinking ethics of consumption and style, so that people can people can enjoy nature on foot rather than an all-terrain vehicle. So there's much to be done. That's a sleeper issue. Global security challenges are clearly worsening, and the great piece of luck that has not happened is China has not yet made a serious stress. As in the years that Russia's making a stress on the international system in Iran and various terrorist groups, and other like small actors, like there's been a major war in Central Africa, there's a major crisis in the Sudan, that people see that when the great powers are distracted by top level crises, that creates opportunities for malign actors to take advantage. And will China be one of them? But we need to reanimate security structures. The real lesson of Ukraine, especially, is we need to make NATO work again. We sort of put it in the museum after 1989. We need to have true equipment pooling, not interoperability, but common weapons design. With the fighter plane that has happened, the F-35. NATO is all flying the same plane. And that makes future situations about parts and having mechanics who know how to operate, making sure the Finnish mechanics can work on a Swedish plane. But that should be everything. That should be everything. And we need to have NATO defense stockpiles. So the ammo should be in one place. We should be thinking about this kind of collective preparedness with things that aren't military. We need to think about having stockpiles that are for medical equipment, but that are constantly renewed. You don't take the medical equipment and bury it under a mountain and dig it out 20 years later. The Americans had that with the respirators, and they pull out the 20-year-old respirators, and guess what? They don't work. Okay? What you need to be doing is thinking about them as an active inventory. So when the respirator turns 3, it's sold, and a new respirator is bought. When the big boxes of plastic gloves turn 12 months old, they are sold, and then new ones are bought. You manage it the way you manage the energy stockpile. And we need to do this collectively. We need to put the collective back in collective security, because Russia, as menacing as it is, obviously the United States is a lot bigger. But the United States alone is not a lot bigger than China. The only way you balance China is by making sure that all of us are in this together with common structures and common resources. One last sleeper issue for the future. We have been on a spasm of self-hatred in the Western world since really, maybe it begins with the rise of Instagram and new social media in the 2010s, but especially since the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. It's summed up by this crazy renaming of streets in Dundas Square in Toronto. And we, I think, need collectively all across the Western world, and we in Canada especially, to rediscover where we came from and rediscover spirits of gratitude toward the people who built the country. If they hadn't built the country, you wouldn't be able to enjoy it. And there's something, I want to say to Canadians that, do you like the society in which you live? Are you grateful for it? Do you feel free? Do you feel prosperous? Do you feel secure? And yes, you're comparing yourself to the American economy, which did better in 23 than the Canadian, but really it's one of the most enviable places in the world to live. You didn't do that. You just you're born here, or you moved here. Somebody else made it. And it's pretty disgusting to say, thank you for making such a wonderful place for me to live. Now I am going to demolish your statue. What have you done that was so great, that entitles you to defame the people who made the world in which you live so happily? So this reanimating the spirit of gratitude. And of course they were imperfect. Are you so great? Will the future admire you so much? They belong to the same human race as you do. They had their limitations and their blindnesses, but that doesn't make their accomplishments unreal, and it doesn't give it doesn't make you any less worm-like, that having not equaled their achievements, you decide you're going to express yourself by devouring theirs.
What a wonderful way to end 12 months of conversation. It reflects the trenchant analysis and insight that I know our listeners and viewers have come to expect. I want to thank you personally, David, for speaking to me, I think approaching 25 times this year. And I look forward rather to 2024. We'll resume these conversations as early as the middle of January, and no doubt we'll have a lot to talk about. Happy holidays to you and your family, and happy holidays to our listeners and viewers.
Have a wonderful Christmas, and let's hope for a fortunate 2024. Peaceful,
Here,
prosperous, and safe.
here.